to us, or if you're watching now, you can go ahead and submit those by typing them into the comment section below the video, and we will answer those. And if you aren't watching this live and you're watching it at a later date, because it is available at a later date, you can always submit questions and we will answer them via email as well as social media sites. So we're going to start right off with a question from Debbie, and she says, how do you allow for pin tucks in a garment or project? I did them years ago, but I don't remember now.
Yeah, so pin tucks are a really pretty kind of delicate looking detail. For anyone who doesn't know, they're just really, really tiny tucks that pull up the fabric. And there are a lot of different ways that you can go about getting your pin tucks. The most common way nowadays to do them is with a twin needle. And the twin needle, I don't have one unfortunately, but the twin needle comes in different sizes. From a 1.6 millimeter up to like a 6 millimeter, which is measuring the distance between the needles. And you can use the twin needle in conjunction with a pin tuck foot, which is a presser foot that just has a bunch of grooves on the underside of it. And they make pin tuck feet in different sizes as well, with 3 grooves, 6 grooves, 9 grooves. And so you thread your twin needle, put your pin tuck foot on your machine, and crank your tension up. The higher you crank your needle tension, the more the fabric will pull up between the needles of the twin needle, and the more pronounced your pin tuck will be. I think I was using a rayon fabric and making pin tucks on a shirt, and I had my tension up to like a 6.5 or a 7. I had it way, way up to get a nice pronounced pin tuck. And what that does is, as your needles are sewing your straight stitch on the top, the bobbin thread on the underside is making kind of a zigzag between the needle threads on the bottom, and having the tension high is going to pull that tight so that you get a little raised tuck. So if you have a pattern, like a commercial pattern that says to sew pin tucks, it should give you instructions on how to mark those out and how much to allow for that. If you are kind of doing your own thing, my advice is always to take your piece of fabric before you cut any pattern pieces out or anything. Take a piece 5 to 10 inches, depending on how many pin tucks you're doing, a lot bigger than the pattern piece is going to be when it's cut out. And sew your pin tucks on the fabric, and then cut your pattern pieces out of the fabric. Because even though the pin tucks aren't taking much out of the measurement of the fabric, if you do a bunch of them across your shirt or whatever you're doing, they add up. And I think I had 13 pin tucks on both sides of a shirt that I was doing, and 13 pin tucks took up like 1.5 to 2 inches of the fabric. So, but that all depends on how raised you're making your pin tucks and a lot of different considerations. But yeah, that's the main method that I've always used on making pin tucks, is using that twin needle.
Definitely. And just doing the pin tucks first is a perfect way to just be able to do that and not have to do any extra math or anything like that.
Right.
Yeah. All right, next question here. This is from Ruby, and she says that she's designing a dress with a mesh top and long sleeves. I am wondering what things you can attach to mesh and how, like crystals or beads, lace, sequins, etc. And can you put them on without using an applique stitch or something like that?
Yeah, so if your mesh is pretty fine, like almost like a lace or a tulle netting kind of thing, you can hand stitch on some beads or sequins, and you can always use some fabric glue, like Aleene's has a crystal glue and a fabric glue to glue those on. Read the instructions on care for the garment afterward. You may not be able to really wash that part of the garment afterward, but read the care instructions. You can do, if the netting is tightly woven enough, you can take a applique and stitch around the perimeter of it, hand stitch or even machine stitch on. But yeah, as far as tips for that, just kind of be careful and take your time. It all depends on what base you're putting your beading onto. But
so
yeah,
how would you do it if you had a really, really open mesh, like for sleeves or something?
If it was very open, that would be kind of tricky. If the threads of the mesh were big enough, you could probably sew beads onto the individual threads or glue things onto the individual threads. So you could still get some embellishments on there. It would just take a little bit. It would just be kind of different than if it was a lot tighter. You wouldn't be able to machine stitch anything onto a really open weave thing. It would all be hand work or gluing.
Right. All right, our next one, speaking of gluing, this is from May, and she wants to know if you have any experience working with acrylic. She needs to glue lots of small acrylic pieces to a wide piece of jersey cotton and wants to know if you have any recommendations for types of adhesives to use.
For adhesives, for that type of application for sewing, gluing acrylic things on, I would recommend an Aleene's glue. That's just, I know we've talked about glue types before, but Aleene's, ALEENE''S, that's the brand that I just happen to always use, and they have a whole bunch of different glue types for different crafting you're doing, but it holds really good and strong, and it holds. I've glued on rhinestones to things, so it dries clear. I like the bottle that they sell their glue in, so that's always my recommendation. That should work for your application with acrylic, but again, it's all very specific to what project you're doing. So read the bottle, go check out a Joann fabric store, or I'm sure they may sell them at Walmart. Walmart has a craft section too, so they may be there. Or you can go online on Amazon, or just type Aleene's craft glue into your search bar, and you can probably even go on the Aleene's website and read care instructions and applications for their glue and everything. But that's my recommendation.
Absolutely. That's my favorite glue too, mostly just because it's the glue my mom always used too. I actually just used it to fix a wooden sign in our kitchen. So I mean, it does literally work on everything. Just because she mentioned gluing it onto jersey, do you know, like if you glue it onto, say, a stretch fabric, is that going to inhibit the stretch? Should you account for that and maybe making it bigger, or something to account for that?
Yeah, depending on how big the pieces that you are gluing on are, whatever area you glue on jersey knit, it will stop that area from stretching. So you could even stretch the jersey knit a little bit and then glue your piece down, or account for losing that stretch in some way.
Perfect. All right, our next question here, this is from Laura, and she says that she needs to make a inner liner for her winter pants. She wants to make it similar to Arctic clothing, but rather than using real fur, which is expensive and requires extra work, she wants to use faux fur. But she wants to know if you know of any faux fur fabric that can be used in garments and pants that won't just fall apart after you wear it a bunch and wash it.
Right. Yeah, I know what kind of fabric she wants. I have a pair of leggings that's made with a really nice stretch fabric that's just pattern on the outside, but on the inside it's faux fur, and it's really super warm and comfortable. I don't know what the fabric is called. I have not seen that kind of fabric at a Joann's fabric store. You can, if you have an independent fabric store around you, you could look there, ask the employees. I actually just did a quick Google search on stretch faux fur, and I found this website called NFT fur fabric. So that could be a name of that type of fabric. So you can search NFT faux fabric. It says it's a performance 4-way stretch fur fabric. You can treat like Lycra. So that would be good for leggings, for things you want to fit tight to your body, like something under your pants. So yeah, just a Google search. Unfortunately, I don't have a name that I can give you with 100% certainty, but good luck with that. That'll turn out really nice.
See, it's a good thing that you answered that question, just because my mind went in a totally different direction, and I'm going to blame the fact that I'm from Alaska, and I was just picturing like literal faux fur and like, I don't know, something entirely different. So I'm glad you handled that question. All right, our next question here. I have lost a button on my shirt. Where can I find one that matches a nice button-down shirt, and what's the best way to sew it back on so it stays?
So you can get buttons at any craft store. I know Joann Fabrics and Crafts has an aisle full of buttons. Walmart, as I mentioned, has most of them have a small craft section, so they should have some buttons. But usually before I go to any big box store, I'll go to my local thrift store, and in addition to looking at whatever garments they have that I can pull the buttons off of, they actually have a rack of just plain buttons that they have in, little bags of similar types of buttons. And a lot of times you'll get, just one button of a type or 2 buttons that match. But if you only need one to replace it from a shirt, that might be all you need. So you can take your shirt with you to make sure it'll match when you go shopping for your buttons. But yeah, I like to thrift my buttons. If you have a local independent fabric store or craft store of any kind, a lot of times they will carry at least some selection of buttons. And then if you can't find a button, like hands-on shopping, you can always look online. I always hesitate to buy things like that online because you're never, it's hard to tell when you're shopping online for fabric or buttons to see if they will actually match, but that is always an option. You can get anything you want online these days. And as for what's the best way to sew it back on, you can go the hand sewing route, but I like to sew my buttons on by the machine. It just seems to hold nice and strong and tight. Of course, if you have shank buttons, that's usually better done by hand. But the flat buttons that have either 2 or 4 holes, you can do those on the machine, and it's really easy and quick. All you have to do is lower your feed dogs so that your fabric doesn't move around. Choose a zigzag stitch on the machine. Remove your presser foot, and sometimes your machine will have a button sewing foot, which is just like a really open toe foot with 2 little prongs that kind of hold the button down. And start by turning your hand wheel to make sure that you got your zigzag stitch set to the correct width for the width of your buttonholes, the holes in your button. So turn the hand wheel to make sure you've got the right width, adjust if necessary, and then you can just hit the foot pedal and let the needle go back and forth 5 or 6 times. And I don't like try to backstitch or anything. All you need to do is take that out from under the presser foot. Leave yourself kind of long thread tails, because what I like to do is pull the thread, pull on the bobbin threads to pull the needle thread through to the back side, and just by hand tie off those threads and then clip the extra threads on the back side. And then you can use some fray check or other kind of fabric glue to put a little dot on the back side on the threads to really make sure that is going to hold nice and tight. I have heard the tip of taking some clear nail polish and use that on the threads as like a way to glue the threads in place, make sure that they won't come off again. So that is also an option. If you don't have any fray check or glue of some kind, you can use your clear nail polish, and that button should not go anywhere.
Absolutely. We actually have a video on our site, of course. Tara Rex, one of our instructors who always does some of the really fun out there projects, she is the one that did the nail polish. The only thing we did find out with that after having tried it out is that it can get a little scratchy if you put a lot or like a big dab on there, because it kind of dries like hard. So if it's going to be directly against your skin, maybe try and find the fray check or something, but definitely can work in a pinch. Sure. All right, our next question here, this is from Amy, and she says, why is my thread jamming and sometimes wrapping around the bobbin?
Ooh, that can happen. I would say first make sure everything is threaded correctly, both on the needle side and in the bobbin side. Make sure your bobbin is wound correctly as well. When you wind your bobbin, you want to make sure that you wind it at a speed that is similar to the speed you're going to be sewing with. And that's not necessarily in answer to this question of getting the thread wound up around the bobbin, but just in general for tension purposes, make sure you wind that bobbin at a consistent, even speed. Just because you can wind your bobbin at 1,000,000 miles an hour doesn't mean you should. I know
we're save time where you can, right?
We're busy people. I know, but I think it'll be better in the long run. Just use a nice medium speed, because what happens is when you wind your bobbin, if you wind at a really high speed, it puts a little extra tension on that thread as it's winding it around the bobbin, and that can come out in your sewing later on. Also, the thread might be getting jammed up around the bobbin if you are using a bobbin that is not the correct size for your machine. So a lot of these bobbins are interchangeable between machines. I've got these metal bobbins that I bought a case of metal bobbins, I don't even know, somewhere 1,000,000 years ago. And they have worked in my fob, they've worked in my brother. But I came across a clear plastic bobbin one time, and I tried to use it in one of my machines, and I was getting all kinds of tension issues, threadness. It was terrible. And I realized it was because that clear plastic bobbin was shorter than the bobbins that my machine wants to take. So if your bobbin is not the right size, if it's shorter or if it's taller than what your machine is made for, you're going to get a lot of tension issues, thread nests, your thread jamming up around your bobbin, all that kind of stuff. It's bad news. So just make sure you've got the right bobbin for your machine. Your machine manual should tell you what size bobbin your machine wants to take, or you can type it into your search bar, your machine brand and model, and then bobbin size. And if you don't have your manual, that should give you the answer to your bobbin size. So thread getting jammed up around the bobbin, without seeing it, it's kind of hard to tell what exactly that means, but it could be the bobbin size, could be some other sort of tension issue. So if it's getting jammed up just on the underside of the fabric, that could be a tension issue. Could be a dull needle. could be a dirty machine, just your lint getting lint and dust and you know, little pieces of thread that come off of your fabric getting built up between the tension discs, built up under your throat plate. So clean out your machine. You can floss out between your tension discs, unscrew on your machine bed, unscrew the throat plate, and take your little lint brush and brush out all the lint. Some people like using a can of air to spray and blast all of the lint out, but sometimes I find that can push the lint further into the machine. So I always just like to use the little lint brush that comes with the machine, swizzle it around in there and pull up whatever lint you can. Make sure you're using the right thread for your needle. So if you're using just a regular universal needle, and if you're using a thicker thread, like a top stitch thread or a heavyweight thread, if that thread is too thick for the eye of your needle, it's going to rub, as it's going through the needle eye, it's going to rub on that needle and put extra tension on that thread. That'll either cause thread breakage or a lot of tension issues, your thread getting jammed up and jumbled up. So make sure you're using the right type of needle for your thread. So yeah, that's a start, a little checklist to go through if you're having some of those issues.
Absolutely. All right, our next one here, this is from Zoe, and she wants to know if you have any tips for altering patterns for different body types, specifically a small waist and larger backside. Store-bought patterns never fit me properly.
That's tough. That's tough. Yeah. Pattern alterations for different body types is a whole, you can go through a whole series of classes on that. Without having, my materials spread out and everything to show, it's kind of hard. But I know Ashley can probably point to some videos on.
How did you know? No, you actually do. I know. We have actually a whole class on pattern alteration that I did, and I believe, I think, don't you have pattern alteration in a section of a class that you did as well?
I do. I have some basic pattern alterations tips. It's not specifically for different body types, but I do in my, I think, intermediate sewing techniques class. I do have a brief section on basic pattern alteration techniques. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. And then the other pattern alteration class that I've done covers everything from the gaping neckline to fixing waists, fixing the seat of a pair of pants, so all sorts of things there too. But can you explain just a little bit about how you can maybe grade between different commercial pattern sizes if you need like sort of a quick fix kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, when you get a new pattern and you know that it's going to need to be altered, definitely cut out a muslin test sample before you jump to your actual fabric that you want your garment to be in. And to start out, before you even get to your fitting sample, you can do some things on the flat pattern, such as measure your body measurements with just, a bra, just undergarments, so you don't get your measurements skewed at all. Measure your body and compare that measurement to the pattern, taking into account that the seam allowances are built into the pattern usually. And you can get a better idea of what size pattern you should cut out. And a lot of times the pattern size 8 or pattern size 10 is not going to fit you exactly in the bust and in the waist and in the hips. People's bodies aren't built the way that commercial patterns make their patterns. Maybe one person in the world would fit that pattern.
How lucky that person is.
Right. Just without making any alterations. So if your bust size is closer matching to say a size 6 of the pattern, and your hips closer match to the size 8 of the pattern. You can grade between those pattern lines to get a closer fit. And then when you cut out your muslin fitting sample, then you can do some more kind of nitpicky things with the lines of the pattern. But it's really as easy as drawing a line in between those pattern lines. So you've got from the bust point down to the hip, you can just start from the size 6 pattern line and just kind of very gently trying to follow the curve of the pattern, blend it into that larger size as it gets down to the hip. Just following that grade, that curve of the pattern that is added as is marked on the tissue paper. Just blending in between the sizes. That's a good place to start if you've got to do some alterations.
Perfect. Yes. All right. Our next question here. This is from Gwen. What is the proper use and what are the advantages of a walking foot?
The walking foot has a lot of different applications, actually. I've got my, if you have a separate walking foot to put on the machine, this is what it's going to look like. My FOF actually has the integrated dual feed foot that is attached to the back of my presser foot. So it acts as a walking foot. All I have to do is reach behind and tuck it down under my presser foot. And I actually find that I have that down most of the time because it just helps keep your layers even. Even if you're not using something like a knit, that is you typically use a walking foot for. It helps keep your layers even. So what it does is it's got a set of feed dogs basically on the underneath of the presser foot. And if you put this on the machine, as you sew, it's going to kind of jump up. Wow, the little presser feet kind of jump down and up. So it kind of walks along your fabric, hence the name the walking foot. And the little feed dogs, the little grippies on the underside of the presser foot, pull that upper layer of fabric along in tandem with the feed dogs on your machine bed, which are pulling the lower layer of fabric along. So this is really useful when you have a lot of layers, such as in quilting. Or if you have a fabric that is really slick, like satin, if you're sewing 2 satin layers together, good luck and use a walking foot. Or even knit fabrics. Jersey knit fabrics are notorious for not wanting to stay even. You can cut your pattern pieces meticulously even, and when you go to sew it, you're gonna just find, you get to the end and you've got an inch left of one layer and your layers just shift, and it can be really frustrating. So a walking foot helps just keep your layers even. Kind of similar to a walking foot also is a roller foot. So if you don't have a walking foot, the roller foot does kind of the same thing. The roller foot just has like a little kind of wheel built into it that's got little like treads on it, sort of. So it kind of rolls as your fabric goes underneath it, and that helps feed that through in conjunction with the lower layer that the feed dogs are pulling through. So a walking foot is really a useful tool. Like I said, I've got my IDT foot on my FOF down all the time. That just helps keep everything even, and it's definitely worth the purchase if you're going to be doing quilting, if you're going to be sewing a lot of knits or velvet. I sewed a velvet skirt, and having my walking foot was really, really useful because having those napped layers facing each other, everything was shifting all over the place. So anything you can do to stabilize those layers is going to help your sewing be just more precise.
Absolutely. All right, our next question here. Tammy says, can you recommend a good brand of thread?
I use Gutermann thread a lot. I use Coats and Clark, but I don't really have like a brand loyalty for thread. A lot of times it's whatever color will match my fabric the best. They're all good threads. I haven't found a thread that I, was unhappy with. So yeah, I have a lot of Gutermann in my thread box. They seem to have a lot of different, a wide array of colors to choose from. So yeah, I guess if I was going to recommend one, I recommend Gutermann, but I would also recommend whatever is on sale.
Absolutely. I do this. Well, I have the Gutermann, but I just have one of those big spinny racks you can get. And really I do use the thread, but it's just really pretty decoration in my sewing room. So I like that as well. But all right, our next question here. This is from Jackie. And she says, I recently did a sewing project using oilcloth. I don't have a walking foot, so I tried using tape under the presser foot to help, which was suggested, but still had problems. Any suggestions or tips for sewing with this fabric?
Yeah, so sewing oilcloth is tricky because it's got that kind of sticky surface like vinyl, like almost like pleather. So the metal underside of your presser foot kind of wants to stick to it, and it makes it hard to go under the presser foot. So if the matte Scotch tape on the underside of the presser foot doesn't really help slide under the foot, you can try a roller foot, as I mentioned, or a Teflon foot. Sometimes it's called a PTFE foot, which is the acronym for whatever scientific plastic name that Teflon is made from. But it looks like this. It's just like a kind of a plastic foot. And the underside is really slick, and that helps those sticky fabrics slide underneath. If you don't have access to one of those feet, or if it's just not really helping, you can try layering a piece of tissue paper over the oilcloth, and that will help. It'll just be the buffer between the sticky oilcloth and your presser foot, so that those two just don't meet, and that should help it slide under the foot.
So if the sticking of the foot wasn't the problem, or maybe is part of the problem, but with working, it's kind of a stiff fabric too. So do you need to make any changes to like stitch length or needle or thread, all of that good stuff?
Yes. Thank you for that follow-up question. Sometimes I get stuck and I need a little prodding. So yes, you'll want to increase your stitch length when stitching on oilcloth for the same reason that you would do that when you're stitching on faux leather or pleather or vinyl, because those fabrics are not really fabrics in the typical sense of being woven. And oilcloth, sometimes you'll get oilcloth might just be like a coating over some fabric. I'm not sure how oilcloth is made.
There's oilcloth, which I think is just like the plastic compressed one, and then there's laminated cotton, which is the one that just has the like coating over the top, but it's still cotton on the underside. But they're still both kind of stiff and plasticky. And
yes, okay, yeah, that's the one I was thinking of. But yeah, anything that has that stiff plastic feel to it, even if it is just a coating, you want to increase your stitch length, because anytime your needle goes through those fabrics, it makes a hole, and that hole is going to stay there. So if you've got a short stitch length, you're basically just going to be perforating that fabric and making your seam weak. So increase your stitch length. You may need to loosen your tension a little bit if you've got thick thicker layers. So decrease your tension so that your threads just have more room to wrap around the thicker fabrics. And make sure you've got a new needle on your machine, since you need to be really piercing that oilcloth fabric. A dull needle, you'll get a lot of tension issues with any fabric, but if you're using a thick fabric, that's that compressed kind of plasticky fabric, you want to make sure your needle is good and sharp.
Absolutely. All right, our next question here, this is from Stacy, and she says, what is there, if any, difference between stabilizer and interfacing?
Yes. So typically when you say stabilizer, you're talking about a stabilizer to use for embroidery, and interfacing you use when you need to stiffen up or strengthen a area of a garment, or purse or something that you're sewing. It'll go behind button plackets, behind buttonholes to strengthen the buttonhole opening. Interfacing goes in the collars of your shirts, cuffs of your shirts, to just give them a little body, a little stiffness, and to strengthen the fabric that you're using. Stabilizer, typically you hoop it on your embroidery machine. Hoop it along with your fabric that you are embroidering, and then it is used to stabilize that fabric as your machine lays down the thread for the design. And stabilizer can either be left under those threads in the design, or it can be washed away. It can be, you can tear it away. So there's the cutaway version of stabilizer, which is really thick, used for when you are embroidering a thick, densely woven, stiff kind of fabric. Tearaway stabilizer is a little bit lighter. That's what I always use when I'm embroidering, because I embroider on quilting cottons and things like that. The water-soluble stabilizer is even thinner, and there's a heat-removable stabilizer, which is also very, very thin, and a lot of times used as a topper to float over the design if you don't want your threads of the design to sink into a pile, such as terry cloth or faux fur or something. It just helps keep the threads kind of lifted up. You've got your different kinds of stabilizers that you want to match your stabilizer weight to whatever fabric weight it is that you are embroidering. And then for the interfacing, if you're using like a commercial pattern, it'll tell you what weight of interfacing to use. Typically in a collar and in cuffs, you're using a lightweight stabilizer, sometimes even a featherweight, depending on what fabric type you're using. If you're using a really thin, lightweight fabric, you'll want to try to sort of match the weight of your interfacing to the weight of the fabric as well, in most cases. So if you're using like a really light, thin fabric, there's a featherweight interfacing, which is really, really lightweight. There's the regular lightweight interfacing, medium weight, and then heavyweight. And then there's, I think, even like craft weight, which is more like for use to stabilize purses, to make nice stiff purses that kind of stand up on their own. And interfacing comes in the iron-on variety that's got little kind of dots of glue on the back for you to use your iron to kind of glue onto your fabric. And it also comes in a sew-in variety. So that's just no glue. You sew it onto your fabric piece, usually baste it within the seam allowances to attach it to the fabric piece, and then sew it into your garment or your purse or whatever you're using. So yeah, they're they're similar and they have some similar uses, but typically interfacing is used in sewing, a lot of times garments, but purses as well. And stabilizer is embroidery use.
Absolutely. All right, the next question here, this is from Doris, and she is making a lined cape, and her concern is static electricity, and she wants to know if there's a lining fabric that is static free, or do you have any other suggestions as to how you would line a cape?
So I don't know that there's a fabric that could be static free, unfortunately. I haven't heard of anything like that. But if you're making the cape with fleece and lining, lightweight fabrics like acetate and acetate rayon, acetate poly blends are typically used for linings. I do find that those are pretty high static fabrics though. So if you just want to use like a lightweight cotton or like a lightweight linen fabric, that might be good as a lining, would feel nice against your skin. But maybe cut down on the static a little bit.
So have you ever used a product, I have it down in my sewing room, I think you find it in like the laundry aisle, but it's called Static Guard. And you normally would spray it on like a dress or something to keep it from sticking to your legs or something. But have you ever used it in your sewing room, like when cutting out patterns and things like that?
I never have. I have seen the cans of it. It's just a spray, like an aerosol, like hairspray, but the Static Guard. I have not used that, but that would be great to have in the sewing room for sure.
I mean, I know I have it, and I'm pretty sure it's down in the sewing room because I don't use the laundry stuff in the laundry room. It's got to be in the sewing room. But I've definitely used it before, but I've never actually used it when I'm cutting out fabric, but I've used it once I've completed something. So I would think it would work both ways, but absolutely. Yeah. All right, next one here. This is from Christine, and she wants to know if thread that is old can affect sewing.
It can. It has the potential to. So if the thread has been stored in direct sunlight, or if it's been stored in a humid environment, that can start to break down the fibers of the thread. And that's when you get a lot of thread breakage, weak seams that can pop, or maybe even just a lot of like thread fraying as it's going through the needle. You'll see a lot of like fibers and dust coming. It'll look like dust, but it's actually the thread sort of breaking apart as it's being put under the stress of going through your needle. So if you notice a lot of lint coming off of that thread, that's a sign that it's not as strong as it should be. So you can kind of test that thread, give it a tug, see how it feels. Because a lot of times with old thread, you don't know how it's been stored. So you can test stitch with it, see how it feels. But if it's been stored properly, away from sunlight and in a dry environment, that thread should last for many, many, many years. And there's a product that Ashley always recommends when we get questions like this that I can't remember the name of, so I'll throw it to you.
It's called Sewer's Aid, and it comes in like a little, you can find it over, I'm going to say like the Notion section of a store, and it comes in just a little squeeze bottle, and it comes out almost like a little eyedropper sort of, or like eye drops, like a Visine bottle, and you just squeeze it, go right down one side of the thread, and that's usually enough. Like as the thread unrolls, it kind of like soaks in. I guess if your thread is like super duper dry, you could do it every, like say you've sewn like half the spool of thread is gone, you could use some more, but usually just one down is enough. It's kind of like a silicone based thread conditioner, I believe it's called. So yeah, Sewer's Aid.
Cool.
Yeah. All right, next question here. This is from Diane, and she says she's trying to sew a big bow, like a fabric hair bow, but large. So think Minnie Mouse size bow onto a tote bag and wants to know what the best way to go about this is.
Yeah, so a Minnie Mouse size bow, so like I know exactly what you mean. My daughter loves Minnie Mouse, so just like, yeah, the big bow, but on a tote bag. So yeah, I would start with like a rectangle of fabric, and depending on how big you want it, kind of you can kind of figure out your measurements. Start with your rectangle, sew the long edges together, right sides together, turn it right side out, and then take those raw ends and fold them. So you've got your rectangle kind of like a tube. Take your raw ends and fold them to the middle. And then you can take another little piece of fabric and kind of cinch it in around the center, and that will that'll cover up the raw edges of your little tube, which you should sew those ends together. But you don't have to finish them, because that little center piece you can kind of use to wrap around and scrunch it up to make it into a bow. And then attach that onto your bag, however you're going to attach it. Hand sew it.
I was gonna say, would you hand sew it? Like, how would you, so you don't like smash down the center or, you know, distort the bow somehow? How would you sew it on if you were adding it to your daughter's tote bag?
I would probably hand sew it, and I would hand sew the center piece that you use to kind of scrunch the bow up. I would hand sew that to it, but then when you stitch that onto the tote bag, I would stitch it just through the back layers so that your thread doesn't come all the way through that front layer of that little thing that's holding your bow together. So just kind of through the back layers, the back, you know, 2 or 3 layers, because you're going to have kind of a lot of layers of fabric there. Just hand sew those to your bag.
Perfect. All right, our next question here. This is from Carol, and she wants to know, when should I use a bound buttonhole?
You can use a bound buttonhole whenever you want. I love bound buttonholes. They're so beautiful. They add like this retro charm to whatever you're sewing. A lot of times they're used in jackets. I see them a lot in wool jackets. But you can use them wherever you want. If you're making a cotton blouse, you can use them in your cotton blouse, and it just adds this extra detail of like you went above and beyond for this blouse, and it's just really kind of impressive to people, even though they're kind of easy to do once you know the technique. So yeah, you can use them whenever you want. You can make the bound section of the buttonhole really small, like a 1/4 inch. You can make them kind of bigger. You can use contrasting fabric for the little like lips of the buttonhole. There are a lot of different cool things that you can do. And I did a video, I believe, and I can't remember if it was part of my intermediate sewing techniques video or if it was in that.
I'm pretty sure it was, because we do have a couple standalone bound buttonhole videos on the site, but I think yours was part of a finishing one or something like that.
Right. Oh, closures.
Yes.
Yeah. I did an entire class on different closures. So zippers, buttonholes, button loops, all kinds of different closures techniques. And the bound buttonhole section is in there. A couple of different techniques to do the bound buttonhole, the patch method and then the strip method. So yeah, there are different ways of getting to the same end result in sewing, depending on what technique you like to use and depending on what fabric you're using. So yeah, that's a good video to watch.
Absolutely, a good class to take. All right, our next one here, this is from Phoebe, and she is sewing scrubs and wants to know what you recommend as a good, easy to wash, comfortable, and durable fabric for making scrubs.
Let's see, for scrubs, so you'll want something easy to wash, like cotton poly blend. I don't know if the regular like quilting cottons would work, if they would be a lot of times those are stiff when they come off the bolt, but when you wash them a lot, they get really nice and soft. So that's an option, but anything that is easily washable, any kind of cotton polyester blend with a nice tight weave so that it doesn't get kind of stretched out. I feel like that would work really well.
So just out of my personal curiosity, because I own an iron, but it never goes anywhere near the laundry room. Like I don't press anything. So like what would be a good fabric that is maybe less wrinkle resistant maybe? So your quilting cotton, I feel like wrinkles a lot sometimes. So if there was a type of fabric that maybe you didn't have to iron every time you washed it.
Yeah. Yeah. Cottons do tend to wrinkle a lot. A linen will wrinkle a lot. Polyester does not wrinkle as much as cotton. So if you've got a higher percentage of polyester in your cotton poly blend, that will make it wrinkle a little bit less. I always like having some cotton though in my garments that I wear most of the time. I feel like if something is all polyester, for some reason it makes me sweat. I don't know what it is. Like even on cold days.
It's because polyester doesn't breathe at all. It just like holds it all in.
Yeah, I don't like 100% polyester things. So cotton is good for the breathability and for the comfort against your skin. So, but yeah, strike that balance of a little bit more polyester in your blend, and hopefully it will not hold on to those wrinkles as much.
Whenever someone says like polyester clothing, I think of my 100% polyester marching band uniform, and that's the only thing I can think of. Like, that's the only time you'd wear polyester or like a weird suit. I don't know.
Yeah,
I think of weird things sometimes.
Makes me itch just thinking about it.
Yeah. All right. Our next question here: what is the best way to evenly gather fabric?
To gather fabric, you can do a lot of different things. So depending on, of course, always depending on your intended end use and your application of it, there's a foot that you can use, the gathering foot, which is not really gathering so much as pleating. So as your fabric goes under the foot, it kind of tucks for you. So it makes these really nice even tucks. So that's pretty hands off once you get the foot on there and you know how to use it. That's you can get those things ruffled up really easily. It's called a ruffling foot, not a gathering foot. Are they the same thing?
I think they are the same thing. I've heard of a ruffler foot, but I think they do the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. But to get gathers, what I always do, because I don't ever have to gather a whole bunch, is I just sew basting lines. I sew 2 lines of basting, 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch away from the raw edge, and then I pull up on the end, leaving yourself long thread tails at the end. I pull up on the end. You can also take a pin and pull up from the center as well if you've got kind of a long area to pull up. You can also lay a line of floss down along wherever you need to gather and zigzag stitch over the floss, and you can gather up over the floss that way. Sometimes that's easier. You don't have to like kind of pull so hard and yank so tight. The floss kind of makes it a little bit easier to gather up. You can also use kind of like a shearing method. You can use elastic thread in your bobbin and just a straight stitch on your machine and sew a line of with that elastic thread in the bobbin. You have to actually sew several lines together in order to get it to kind of gather up. And that's good for lightweight fabrics. The heavier your fabric gets, even if you're trying to do 2 layers of fabric, it's not going to gather as much as if you just do 1 layer of a lighter weight fabric. But that's a way of getting your fabric to gather up. So Depending on your intended end use, you can choose from one of those methods. If you have a whole bunch, like if you're trying to do a ruffle for a bed skirt or something like that, and you've got this whole thing you need to gather up, a gathering foot might be your best bet, because trying to pull on basting threads for something that long might get really tedious.
Yes, I agree. So I've tried the floss method one time. I believe we have a video on the site on how to do that. And when I've done it, I found that when you gather it, if you don't immediately pin it to something, it tends to fall apart or fall back out. So how do you sort of hold it together as you're gathering so it doesn't just keep like sliding all the way off?
Right. You can use pins right along your gathering line to like kind of tack it down. And yeah, keep that in place, because especially if you're using a fabric that's a little stiffer, when you let it go, it might just kind of spring back out. So yeah, pin those gathers down along your gathering line to make sure that doesn't happen.
Perfect. All right, next question here. What are the different sides of a seam ripper used for?
So your seam ripper, a lot of times, yes, will come with two different ends. And the one end will be your seam ripper. So everyone should know what a seam ripper is. If you don't know what it is, you will know.
No way.
So yes, that'll be one end. And on the other end, I don't have one on mine, but the other end will a lot of times be this kind of thing. I don't even know if you can see it. It's so tiny. It's just this metal loop, and that is used for threading your needle. So this tiny little metal loop goes through the end of your needle, through the eye of your needle, and then you thread your thread through this metal loop and then pull that back out through the eye of your needle. And that's an easy way to thread a needle quickly. A lot of times it's hard to get that end of the thread through a small needle eye if it's not, if your thread is not, if it's got a little tail, it's impossible to get through a tiny little eye. So that's a lot of times what's on the other end of your seam ripper, is just that little metal loop, which is to thread your needle.
So I actually read that question differently in my mind, and I was thinking they were asking, why is one side pointy and why does one side have the little red ball on it? I don't know how they were intending it, so we're going to cover both questions just in case.
I will answer that too. Yeah, we talked about that question before. I'm like, yeah, I can answer that. Totally different. So yeah, you've got two ends of your seam ripper. You've got this pointy end, and then you've got the little ball end. And that is so that when you, it has a lot of different uses. This is I use these things all the time. But so when you are ripping a seam, and if you have to rip like the entire thing, you go in with this ball side first, and that makes sure, so if you try to go in with the pointy side first, you're going to snag on your fabric, and you might, poke holes in something you shouldn't be poking holes in. So the ball side, just make sure you're not poking into anything you shouldn't be poking into. It's going to keep the bottom layer of your fabric safe, depending on whatever it is that you're ripping. And you can just kind of go right up along the seam and cut those threads and rip that seam out. So that is what I've always used that ball side for.
Absolutely. And it's always a bummer when you have to do that, because that means you're ripping out an entire seam, but it happens to everybody.
It does. It happens to the best of us.
Absolutely. We know, if Nicki has to use her seam ripper, we know it's okay if we all have to use ours as well. But perfect. We are at the end of our hour, so I hope we answered everyone's questions. If you tuned in and asked your question, hopefully we answered that to your liking. And definitely tune back in next month. We'll be answering even more questions. And if you didn't get a chance to watch this live and you have questions, you can still enter those. We'll answer them via email. And also, we're always available on social media to answer questions as well. So thank you again so much, Nicki. I hope you have a wonderful night, and everyone else as well.
Night.